a young American woman sent to Rome for a life of service to the church discovers a dark conspiracy, leading her to question her faith and confront the birth of evil incarnate. Welcome back to Movies Explained. Today's feature is a 2024 horror film titled The First Omen. The movie begins in 1971 when a former priest named Brennan, who had been excommunicated, meets Father Harris in a church. Harris gives Brennan a photo of a newborn baby girl, warning him that she wasn't conceived naturally. He further explains that the pregnancy happened too quickly and the baby, who is now a teenager, is being closely watched until she is old enough. Brennan asks, "Old enough for what?" But Harris responds that he can't share any more details. In another flashback, the girl begs, "Don't let it touch me again." A demonic growl draws near the girl, and Brennan realizes that Harris has vanished. Brennan exits the church in search of him, telling Harris that hiding won't absolve his sins. Harris replies that he doesn't want to be forgiven but wants it all to be over, and that Brennan will understand soon enough. Suddenly, as men are working on a scaffold to reach a stained glass window, a metal pipe falls and strikes Father Harris on the head. He seems fine at first, but as he walks away, Brennan realizes that his brain has been torn out. In Rome, a newcomer named Margaret arrives from the US and is greeted by Father Gabriel and Cardinal Lawrence. As they travel, Margaret is eager to explore the city, but she also notices that protests have been increasing, so it is not a good idea to wander out alone. Cardinal Lawrence explains to Margaret that the world is changing and young people are no longer seeking guidance from the church. When they arrive at the orphanage, Margaret meets Sister Silva, who is the head and main caregiver. The orphanage exclusively houses girls, currently accommodating around 62 individuals from infants to 18-year-olds. Additionally, the state has arranged for them to take in many unmarried pregnant women, and they even offer birthing services in their infirmary. During the tour, Margaret encounters Sister Angelica, who isn't very friendly and seems rather annoyed by Margaret's presence. However, Sister Silva explains that Sister Angelica was abandoned and raised at the orphanage, but she is very devoted and makes the other girls happy. Suddenly, they hear a loud scream, and Sister Silva rushes over to check what's going on. Left alone, Margaret hears singing and walks into a nearby room. Upon entering, she finds a girl named Carita. Margaret tries to talk to Carita, but Carita behaves strangely, slowly approaching Margaret and licking her cheek. Carita also appears a little aggressive and violent. Moments later, Sister Silva shows up again and takes Margaret away, leaving Carita alone. Before leaving, Carita gives Margaret one of her drawings. Outside, Margaret inquires as to why Carita is the only one locked up, and Sister Silva explains that Carita hurt another girl the day before. Later, Margaret met her driver, Luca, because the ongoing demonstrations made Rome a bit dangerous. That night, she arrived at her hotel and looked at the drawing Carita had given her. It showed a girl surrounded by 4 people in robes, making Margaret wonder what it could mean. The next day, Margaret begins her day with a morning prayer when she starts hearing whispers of a woman's voice. As she looks around her room, a nun suddenly appears with a loud voice, scaring her until she realizes it's just her roommate Luce entering the room. Margaret looks back to where the nun appeared, only to see her robe hanging from the wall. Margaret introduces herself to her roommate, Luce, who was also a novice there to take her vows. However, Luce liked to go to clubs and bars at night before becoming a nun. The following morning, Margaret spent time with the girls at the orphanage and noticed that Carita was kept separate at the back of the class. In the evening, Margaret notices that Carita is not in her room. She goes out to look for her and is shocked to see a nun strapping Carita to her bed, with another nun shutting the door. As Margaret processes this, she hears a woman laughing and sees a nun near the entrance of the room. The nun's laughter quickly turns into tears streaming down her face. At that moment, Luce pops up behind Margaret, startling her. Luce suggests they go out to a nightclub. Margaret is hesitant but eventually agrees. At the club, 2 boys named Alfonso and Paolo approach them. Luce quickly starts dancing with Alfonso, and Paolo joins Margaret. While dancing, Paolo touches Margaret's hair, looks at her head, and then kisses her. The next morning, Margaret wakes up with no memory of the previous night. Luce reassures her that she found her before things got out of hand, and they both return home as good friends. After praying all morning, Margaret is alone when Father Brennan approaches her. He warns her to be careful around Carita because evil things happen around her. Margaret is confused and tries to leave, but Father Brennan insists she meet him that night so he can explain what's happening at the orphanage. Afterward, Margaret realizes that Carita is missing. When she goes searching for her, a young girl informs her that Carita is in the bad room. Margaret continues her search for answers and eventually finds Sister Silva, whom she tells about Carita being locked in a room. Sister Silva explains that Carita was placed in the bad room because she bit Sister Romano, and when Margaret questions why there is even a bad room, Sister Silva responds, "Because some girls are bad." When Carita is finally let out, Margaret talks to her and they start to bond, but they are interrupted by a scream. Margaret goes to investigate and finds herself in the infirmary, where she discovers a woman who is about to give birth. The woman's screams of pain suddenly transform into a creepy smile as long, thin claws start emerging from her body, causing Margaret to faint instantly. When she wakes up, she is told that everything is fine and that she likely just had a sugar crash. Outside, everyone is having a good time. Margaret spots Carita at one of the tables and goes to talk to her. However, she sees Sister Angelica sitting next to Carita, holding a drawing she made. It shows a girl lying on a bed with a baby in her womb. But Sister Angelica added this part. Margaret finds it inappropriate, which angers Angelica, causing her to storm off. However, Angelica returns and unexpectedly kisses Margaret on the lips before leaving once more. Margaret is confused, but takes Carita to play with other girls. Suddenly, something grabs her attention. It is Sister Angelica from an upper balcony. Angelica yells to Margaret that this is all for her, then sets herself on fire and jumps, ultimately hanging herself. This shocks everyone, especially Margaret, who remembers Father Brennan's warning. So, in the evening, she goes to the address he gave her, where he explains what's happening. First, Father Brennan shows Margaret the photograph he got from Father Harris. In it, there's a father Margaret recognized from the orphanage when she arrived there. She also sees Sister Silva holding a baby next to another nun. Father Brennan thinks the baby might be Carita. Then, he explains that there are two types of churches, one that follows Christ's teachings and another that does terrible things like torture, rape, and murder in the name of God. This second church is afraid that people will stop following religion and believes that public institutions and laws should be influenced by religion. As a result, a small but influential group of priests and bishops decided that they needed to take drastic action. They believe that they can bring the Antichrist into the world and control him in order to make people return to the church by allowing him to spread evil. Father Brennan suspects that the girl in the photo will be the Antichrist's mother, but he doesn't have many connections with the church since he was kicked out. He needs to know if Carita was born on the 6th day of the 6th month at 6 a.m., which would give her the devil's mark, 666, on her body. They keep these records at the orphanage, so Father Brennan asks Margaret to bring them to him. He further explains that there is a beast they are mating, a jackal. Margaret begins to leave, but he tells her that if Carita is the mother, the evil inside her will do whatever it takes to stop them and urges Margaret to help destroy it at all costs. Despite his plea, Margaret remains unconvinced and refuses to help him. One morning, there's a trip, but Margaret can't stop thinking about what Father Brennan told her. She asks Father Gabriel if he knows anything about it or where she can find out more, but he doesn't want to talk about it. Later, Margaret goes to talk to Carita by herself. She asks if anything has scared or upset her before. Carita says sometimes she has bad feelings and sees things that bother her. Margaret tries to tell her they are not real, just mere illusions, but Carita gets upset and leaves. As Margaret follows her, she discovers Carita seated by a window. A nun's hand rests on Carita's back, and to Margaret's horror, she realizes it's Angelica. Suddenly, Sister Silver shows up out of nowhere. She informs Margaret a riot has broken out, and they have to leave right away. Later that evening, when they return to the orphanage, Sister Silver and Cardinal Lawrence think it is best for Margaret to delay her vows. When Margaret asks why, they worry that her closeness to Carita is making her feel unwell. They even suspect that it's making Margaret sick being so close to her. They order her to keep her distance from Carita, or there will be consequences. Feeling like no one else cares about Carita, Margaret leaves. As she heads back to her hotel, Margaret spots Paolo on the streets. She tries to talk to him, but he evades her and warns her to stop following him. In a final moment, he locks eyes with Margaret and tells her to look for the mark, just before a pickup truck collides with him, slamming him into a wall. Margaret rushes to his aid, but in her attempt to help, she accidentally causes fatal injuries, splitting his body in two. This makes her even more certain that something's not right. So, on the day Luce takes her vows, Margaret uses the busy ceremony as a chance to sneak into Sister Silver's office. Inside, Margaret discovers keys that open a secret passage. She follows it to a basement where she finds files about babies named Sienna. Each file contains a photo of a disfigured baby with a birthmark in the shape of 3 sixes. Carita appears to be the only survivor. Convinced Carita is in danger, Margaret rushes out with the files, pulling Carita into a room with her and putting a chair so no one enters. She apologizes to Carita for not trusting her before, saying she believes her now. As the nuns bang on the door to enter, Margaret quickly hides the files. That's when Sister Silva and other nuns burst in. Margaret turns on them, saying she knows what they're doing and what they've done with the babies. Margaret tries to fight back, but they overpower her and throw her on the ground. When Carita tries to intervene, it's there Margaret spots the mark of 3 sixes on Carita's mouth. The nuns take Margaret and lock her in the bad room. At night, Margaret experiences a vision and hears whispers. While searching under the bed, Margaret discovers a drawing likely created by young Carita. Pulling back the carpet unveils another unsettling illustration beneath, triggering a series of haunting visions. Margaret realizes with horror that the women are being forcibly impregnated by a beast, birthing children meant to usher in the Antichrist's arrival. She tries to convince herself these visions are mere delusions, but then a startling voice pierces the air as Angelica's ghost appears in the corner, slowly advancing toward her. Terrified, Margaret is about to panic when Father Gabriel arrives and tells her that he has found the files and they need to leave immediately. They visit Father Brennan, who recognizes them and lets them in. Gabriel gives the files to Brennan and begins to dig through them. It is revealed that Brennan had approached Gabriel before, but Gabriel had dismissed him as crazy. Margaret wants to search for Carita, but Father Gabriel explains they won't allow her near after what happened. Plus, it is only a matter of time before they notice the missing files and search for them, so they must prove their actions. Otherwise, no one will believe what they say. Later, Father Brennan explains they need a male so it can mate with its offspring, but so far they've only had female births, and all except Carita have died. After many failed attempts, they think the only solution is for the beast to mate with its own offspring. However, Margaret notices something strange. In the baby's photo, the mark is on her head, while Carita's mark is on her palate. This means that the baby in the photo is not Carita, and that there's another girl with the same mark on her scalp. Margaret recalls Paolo's words before he was killed and looks for the mark. She remembers the night he checked her hair. Suddenly, a repressed memory violently resurfaces. She was forcibly impregnated by the beast itself during a satanic ritual on that evening at the disco when she blacked out. Overwhelmed by this sickening revelation, Margaret breaks down in tears. Gabriel and Brennan attempt to console her, but their efforts are disrupted when Brennan, inspecting her scalp, recoils in horror at the sight of the dreaded 666 mark. He gravely explains that Margaret has been a ward of the church her entire life. likely shuffled from place to place to cover their tracks. Realizing Carita is too young, they must have brought Margaret back to Rome for their evil purposes. It is the 6th of the 6th month, and Father Brennan believes they will come for her. Upon discovering her pregnancy, Margaret decides that the only solution is to have the baby surgically removed from her womb. Father Brennan knows an experienced doctor and suggests that they should meet with him as soon as possible, so they set off with Luca's help. However, time is running out. As they're driving, Margaret's health starts to deteriorate and she begins to vomit. Suddenly, another car crashes into them, killing everyone except Margaret. As Margaret exits the wrecked car, she begins to suffer convulsions and her belly swells up. She becomes unrecognizable as the demons are controlling her body. Later, she wakes up strapped to her bed in a room with Cardinal Lawrence beside her. He promises to protect her and says the baby she'll have will save the church and bring people back to God. She is then taken to a different room for the delivery. There are scalpels nearby, and a doctor uses one to open her womb. They all watch as she screams in pain. Margaret gives birth to twins, a boy and a girl. They believe they've finally got the Antichrist, and everyone is eager to touch him. Margaret asks them to let her hold him, claiming it's her right as the mother. In a startling twist, Margaret plunges a blade into Lawrence's neck, shocking everyone present. However, she finds herself unable to kill her own son and end the demonic ritual. Seizing the opportunity, Sister Silva successfully manages to snatch the baby away from her. Before Margaret can react, Lucy's knife pierces her flesh and she collapses to the floor. With the baby in their hands, Sister Silva orders them to burn everything down and erase any evidence, intending to kill Margaret and her daughter. They are surrounded by fire, but Carita shows up unexpectedly at the right time and helps them escape. As Margaret gazes back at the raging inferno consuming everything in its path, her eyes widen in terror as she catches a chilling glimpse of her assailant, an ominous, demonic jackal, its soulless eyes piercing through the scorching blaze. Meanwhile, the church has found the perfect man to be the baby's father, the U.S. ambassador in Rome. They plan for him and his wife to suffer a tragic loss and be in need of a child. The boy will inherit their privilege and power. The scene changes to years later, where Margaret, her daughter, and Carita live in a secluded mountain cabin as a happy family. All of a sudden, they hear a noise. Upon investigating, Margaret finds out that it is Father Brennan. Threatening him with a gun, Margaret tells him to leave, but all he wants is to warn them that they are known to be alive. He explains that none of them were supposed to survive, especially not the girl, and they will come for her. Margaret tells him they just want to be left alone and loads the rifle. Brennan acknowledges and turns to walk away. But before leaving, he tells her your son has been given a name. It's Damien, and the film ends there. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe for more videos.